So after the failed Annapolis meeting, okay, let's be honest, you only had 5 of the 13 states sending delegates. This is not going to be a successful meeting. The decision was made to essentially, cut your losses. Let's meet again in the spring in Philadelphia. Now the idea was that with that time frame, maybe they could convince other states that they needed to send delegates. And this actually did work out well. It did dramatically change the type of meeting that was going on. Now, the delegates that were sent to Philadelphia, however, were given some very, very specific instructions. The whole reason that these delegates were meeting was, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Their job was to get together to look at the Articles of Confederation, see what needed to be changed, if anything, make those recommendations, and then we could move forward from there. The idea was to adapt the Articles to what was going on in the real world. Now, the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that if you wanted to make any kind of amendment or change, it was difficult. You had to get the unanimous consent of all 13 states. Trying to get a change made to the Articles was not a feasible thought. Generally speaking, you can look at a group of 13 individuals, and oftentimes it's going to be difficult to get them to agree to something, let alone if you're trying to get the representatives of a bunch of different states to do so. That's going to be a big challenge. Remember, some of the states, they were very, very happy with the way the Articles were working, others not so much. Plus, given the fact that you had to have a unanimous vote of all 13 states to make any kind of changes, only 12 states were actually represented. Rhode Island refused to even participate in this. Now, you can make the argument that Rhode Island chose not to participate because as a very small state, they wanted to make sure that the larger states understood, look, we're just as powerful and tough as you guys are. So even if they had come up with the perfect solution, the absolute most wonderful way to go through and change the Articles of Confederation, there was no way they could actually enact those changes since they didn't have the even possibility of unanimous consent. So the 55 delegates that were there, the first thing they did was they blew off their instructions. Okay, they were given the instructions of, basically tweaking the Articles of Confederation. They decided to scrap the Articles of Confederation. They behaved in what's referred to as an extra-legal manner. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't exactly legal. And so in this case, they've decided to just toss the Articles of Confederation, start over from scratch, start writing a brand new constitution for the United States, and this would be one they hoped would last into all eternity. So the people who are physically in Philadelphia, the guys who are making up the delegates to this now constitutional convention, okay, they are a select group of economic and political notables, not the least of which, remember, George Washington is going to be the president of basically this convention. There is a chair on which he sat, which can still be seen if you go to Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and on the back of the chair is half of a sun. And the question at the time was whether or not that was a rising or a setting sun. So this was a group of select individuals. They had all been involved either in state or national governments. Many had been part of the drafting and or voting on both the Articles of Confederation and on the Declaration of Independence. These were names that were known from the Revolution. So these were, big name people. It wasn't just that they were choosing, random individuals to come work on this. For the most part, they were men of wealth. Okay, they were not poor off. Many were college graduates. Now you have to stop and think about how rare a college diploma would have been at this point in time, a college education. Even today I've seen studies that say, it may just be that a third of the people who start college actually finish it. So even today, a college degree is not a common occurrence. You can look back here and think about how much rarer it was then. Most of them were coastal residents. Okay, most of them came from the coast. Now, the United States at this point, even though we do have all that land from the Mississippi east, were still predominantly hugging the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. So most of these are going to be coastal residents. A significant number of them were urbanites. They were from an urban center, from a city. Now, up until the Civil War, the United States was a predominantly rural agricultural nation. Most people lived on small, farms or small towns. We did have cities, of course, but the vast majority of people did not live in those cities. It wasn't until after the Civil War people started moving there. So the fact that you have a significant number from urban centers does affect what we're going to be looking at. Now, the whole aspect of what they're trying to do here is they're trying to put philosophy into action. They're trying to take the concepts they have of how government should work and actually making those concrete in that we're going to form a government. Now, you got to keep in mind that of the delegates to Philadelphia, there were a very large number of different philosophical views represented. There were, different factions, for lack of a better term, who thought this way or that. But even though you did have a very broad idea of, what should be happening, there were a number of areas on which the delegates did agree. Questions like human nature. Okay, are people generally nice to one another, or are they generally just in it for themselves, kind of thing? The causes of political conflict. Why is it that you do have problems? And then you also would get the object and nature of a Republican government. Now, please notice that's a small r Republican, meaning that a government in which the people are represented by elected officials. Now, the delegates were united in their belief that people were self-interested, that most people are only going to care about what is best for them, and if it hurts other people in the process, that may not be the intent, but that's not as big a concern. The concept is that there are those who are quite willing to walk over others to get what they want. And so they believed that that was, a very large portion of human nature, and that as such, government would need to play a role in checking and containing that natural self-interest of the people. Now, this is not saying government control or anything along those lines, but it's essentially talking about the restraint of the more base portions of human nature. Now, James Madison, who's referred to often as the father of the Constitution, he also had the unfortunate nickname of Little Jimmy. George Washington stood about 6'2". James Madison stood about 5'4". So there was a bit of a height difference there. He is probably the most influential member of the convention in regards to translating political philosophy into actual government architecture. It was Madison who did a huge portion of the work going through and taking all these different philosophical ideas and ideals that the delegates had and turning them into an actual working government. Now, Madison believed that the distribution of wealth or property is oftentimes the source of political conflict, that you do have those without will oftentimes be either envious or resentful of those with. And so as a result, he's trying to look at more of the not equal distribution of wealth, but we'll talk more later on about the equality of opportunity as opposed to the equality of results, basically. Now, his argument was that factions arise from the unequal distribution of wealth. Okay, one faction is the majority. Okay, the majority is going to be, in this case, those who have little or no property. And the other faction is the minority, those few who hold wealth. So the concern is that there's going to be friction between those with little to no property and those with a great deal of property. And this has long been an argument in regards to a lot of political philosophies, is how do you balance that out, the haves versus the have-nots. Now, Madison went through, and like all the other delegates, he believed that either a majority or a minority faction would become tyrannical if it goes unchecked and has too much power. You can think in terms of the phrase mobocracy, the idea that any group, and it doesn't matter, if they get too much power, the old saying is, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The concern is that unchecked, it will become tyrannical. And so that was one of the concerns that they were trying to prevent with the Constitution. Property has to be protected against the tyrannical tendencies of faction. It's the idea of people not being allowed to take from someone just because kind of thing. The basic idea here is that good government is balanced government. So long as no one faction of society can actually seize complete control of government, then tyranny could be avoided. The idea was to try to make sure that all the different factions that would eventually arise would be balanced out with one another, so that way no one faction would be able to become a tyrannical power within the United States.